What everybody knows about Britain, except the British. How do you see Britain? That might depend on your point of view. And as a long-time British foreign correspondent, Michael Peel has come to understand it can look very different from the outside. Delighted to say that joining me from somewhere in the UK, I should imagine, is the author of What Everybody Knows About Britain, Except the British. And that is Michael Peel. Michael, good morning to you.
Good morning, Giles. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. What has sort of inspired you to take this view? I mean, as a foreign correspondent, do you think it gives you particularly? I mean, obviously, I'm speaking to you from a studio in southern Spain, so we kind of look back at the UK and probably shake our heads or stand to attention, on the terrace. So, what's inspired you to put this book together?
Well, thanks, Giles. I've been away quite a long time, just come back to the UK after almost 13 years in several different places across the world. And I had this sense of seeing my own country, Britain, a bit more clearly from the outside. And it seemed at times that things were not going very well, but that perhaps people hadn't sort of realized quite how not well they were going in some ways. And also, I had this sense of, in Southeast Asia, for example, when I lived in Thailand, how Britain projected itself there was quite different from the kind of narrative you heard back home. So it was partly about that. It was partly about the way we look at ourselves. It was also partly about the fact that suddenly this kind of narrative has taken hold and caught up with the sense that things are not going well. Everything is broken, nothing works, and there are a lot of problems. But at the same time, Britain still has a lot of advantages. It has a lot going for it. And so this book is about being kind of unsparing about saying some things are going wrong and we really need to fix them, but also a healthy dose of optimism and saying, look, these are problems that can be fixed and we have the means to fix them.
Because there seems to be this very sort of the very British sort of mix of complaining about how bad things are and harking back to the halcyon days, which were never really there, but at the same time fiercely defending what it is to be British.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of putting it. And, I go into, for example, linking up ideas about nostalgia in our culture and looking at sort of things of my own childhood, like the Beano, my favorite comic, and when I was a kid, and how that's evolved over the years. And also looking at our misplaced sense of ourselves, about surveys which show that we're not just wrong sometimes, but kind of wildly wrong about, how we look at the country in terms of the demographics, in terms of what we spend money on as a country, and so on. And so there's some really interesting points about self-perception there, which I try and bring out, and all the way through bringing out some of the kind of humor as well, and some of the absurdity, which is very serious, but also kind of crazy. Things like, for example, Liz Truss has had her book out the week before mine's coming out, and she's written a book called 10 Years to Save the West. This is a prime minister with a 10-year program when her premiership didn't even last 10 weeks. I mean, it's absurd. And it shows something of the nature of, the kind of political crisis, institutional crisis of confidence that we need to deal with.
Ah, yes, but there was a dark cabal of secreted vegetables in the freezer that put her to the sword. Surely.
Well, indeed, she did finger a copy of the Financial Times, my own newspaper, as a sort of discussion about the deep state. And a colleague of mine wrote a very good lunch with the FT with her at the weekend. Give that a quick plug. But indeed, I mean, there's a lot of this rhetoric which is absurd, but it's also dangerous as well, right? Because history shows us when people go into sort of conspiratorial sort of allegations without any evidence at all, then that can lead countries into quite dark places.
It's been interesting as well, isn't it, about how, the Englishman abroad. I mean, I'm not going to break into Sting's Englishman in New York, but I'm an immigrant. I'm living in Spain. I'm not an expat. I'm an immigrant, but British abroad see themselves as expat. And is it a particular hangover from empire that the British perhaps don't assimilate on them? You might say the British don't assimilate as well in other countries, and therefore that gives them a particular worldview as well.
Yeah, I think there's a very interesting point about, for example, the English language, which obviously for reasons, for historical reasons, because of the empire and so on, has become a kind of a lingua franca in many places, and a language of global business and diplomacy, which in one sense is a massive advantage if you come from a country like Britain, where it is the first language. But of course, the downside of that is that it tends to channel people into relying on English and not learning other languages, as people in many other countries do. And that kind of encapsulates quite well both the advantages Britain has, but also some of the sort of negatives of that as well. And of course, at worst, that can lead to a very kind of parochial and outdated attitude about Britain's position in the world.
And also, there's perhaps a little bit of the whole image of, because as we say in this part of the world, El Brexit, which had a remarkable effect on how Britain sees itself and how Europe and much of the world sees itself as well. And it went from being, this whole thing about sovereignty, and, my Spanish friends sort of having lunches with them, and they just sort of shake their heads and go, what were you doing?
Yeah, I mean, Brexit, it's not a book about Brexit, but obviously, Brexit crops up in a number of places in the book. And it's kind of a symptom, I think, of the way Britain is sort of wrestling with itself about its modern identity. And I think that, one thing that was very striking in the book was I interviewed a former senior diplomat from Singapore, which is obviously a country that was once under British occupation, but now in the modern era is very much wealthier than Britain, and has sort of made an extraordinary kind of economic story out of very few natural resources. And she actually appeared in a parliamentary committee, and there's a really interesting exchange with a pro-Brexit MP who has the idea that she might be pro-Brexit, but then she makes it clear that she's not, and he tries to shut the debate down. And I asked her, why do you think Brexit was a bad idea? And she was very sort of hard-nosed about it. She said, well, look, you've just got to be in the room, right? And Singapore, as a small country in a region with powerful countries, we make alliances because, if you're not in the room, then other people who are in the room can make decisions that you don't like. And that logic applies whether you're in a tenants association in an apartment block or whether you're in a multilateral organization like the EU, which I thought was a very sort of interesting way of looking at it.
How much does the colonial part feel like influence how other countries see Britain? I mean, because I'll be talking from a European standpoint, but you mentioned Singapore, and so therefore places that, with the pink bits on the map, so Commonwealth and former colonies. How has that coloured because their vision of how, what Britain is, and to opposed to the thing that how Britons see themselves has to be different.
It does, and it varies in places you are. I mean, I in the book, there's a chapter about exactly this legacy, and it looks at the way that countries which were under imperial occupation by Britain, people from them are coming back and bringing court cases in, the home of the former metropole, the home of the former occupier, and some of these are about cases directly to do with colonialism, torture, colonial era, Kenya, and so on. But some of them are a bit more subtle. So I talk about a case where in a country where I lived, the first time I lived outside the UK, which was in Nigeria, where the whole story of the oil industry has really played a sort of massive role in shaping how modern Nigeria is, because it's it's where the wealth has come from. And this case has been brought by a group of villagers about pollution, and they're trying to get compensation from Shell, and this has generated a big court case in London. Now Shell is contesting the case, but the point is that in a way, this is a legacy of colonialism because, as I point out, Shell first got active in Nigeria in the 1930s when it was under colonial rule, and its modern place as Nigeria's leading oil producer is directly rooted in those days. So there are these sort of echoes all the way through in terms of the modern relations that countries that were formerly occupied with Britain have with Britain. But the final point to add is that there's still a remarkable sort of degree of perhaps charitable sort of views of Britain in many places, including places that were formerly occupied by it, and people actually, showing a surprising amount of goodwill in the circumstance as well. And, almost everywhere I've ever been, I've always had a very warm welcome from people, and I'm very grateful for that.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's been very easy to sort of go, oh yes, well, we've now become the sick man of Europe, and it's all the repatriation things. But there are good points, and there are people who look very favourably upon the British.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And obviously, history, one of the points of the book is that history must be reckoned with, but we shouldn't be paralyzed by history. And I think most places I've been, people recognize that. And there is definitely, I think, a way in which Britain has still not fully reckoned with and accounted for its history. And the modern, debate over the publications about the history of empire and the kind of furious debates that has sparked really show that. And, the current kind of attacks on institutions such as the National Trust, which want to sort of show a bit, more about how, historic properties have been linked to slavery or other forms of exploitation. But at the same time, the world is a big and complicated place, and people, there are all kinds of relations that modern Britain has, and if it reaches out in the right way with, the necessary kind of humility, where needed, then there's no reason Britain can't be a progressive and significant player in the world.
Is that perhaps the trick then? Is to actually stop looking at ourselves through sort of rose-colored binoculars, in the mirror, and say, okay, we're not as great as we think that we once were, or we're not the world force that we think we once were, haven't been since just before the Second World War. But we should perhaps embrace, our multiculturalism, our modernity, and the positive aspects that we've done to the world.
I think you put your finger on it with the word modernity, and one of the other people I interviewed for the book is David Edgerton, who's a historian of 20th century Britain, and he has this idea which he calls the politics of modesty, which essentially tries to bring all the things we've been talking about together. It includes a kind of reckoning with acknowledgement of history, and also a sense that Britain is not a superpower, but at the same time that it has advantages, still on the UN Security Council and a permanent member, and all these other things in which it does have great advantages and power still, and uses those in a modest and strategic way, and a progressive way. And I think that idea of the politics of modesty is actually quite a powerful one. And I think, dropping the idea of Great Britain except as a, geographical signifier would be quite a good start, and might help a country to find its place in the world. But the other thing is, of course, that, at home, as everyone now sees and comments on, there's a big job to be done of rebuilding, of reducing inequality, of renovating public services. And that's going to be a massive thing that the country needs to concentrate on in the coming years, whoever's in government.
But that's surely because as you will know, Michael, the problem at the moment is that politics has not become nuanced. It's become black or white. There are no shades at the moment in between. And I wasn't going to use the W word on a Monday morning, but if you come up with anything alternative or taking into consideration other races, religions, whatever, you are shot down with the woke word, and that's it seems to have polarized certain sections of the UK or just England in ways that would have been unthinkable about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the atmosphere is pretty febrile politically, and I think this obviously reflects the fact that we've got an election coming up, and there's a lot at stake. But I think I tend to be sort of quite, optimistic about people, in the sense that my experience, in Britain and everywhere else I've lived and visited, is that, most people are fairly sensible most of the time, and do have a sort of sense of nuance about things, and that, it's a cliche, but it's true that obviously obviously the frenetic social media environment we live in, it does tend to amplify the most extreme views and perhaps sort of not fully, get down to, what in conversation, as we all know, often emerges that, we all contain multitudes and we all are capable of looking at things in complicated and nuanced ways where that's needed, and that we, most of us have a sort of sense of empathy that means we do want to rub along together and live and let live.
I suppose the underlying fact is, the very British trait of everything will be okay after a slice of cake and a cup of tea, and it'll turn out okay in the end.
And that does certainly have a lot of very positive sides. I mean, there's also a sort of negative side to that, which is it can lead and perhaps has led to a kind of complacency that, we are Britain and everything will be okay in the end. And I think that, there has been this, it's quite interesting from the outside. And then in the last few months, having come back here from the inside, sort of seeing how, there has been this shift to people across societies concluding that there are things that are quite sort of deeply wrong with the way society and basic services are working, and that is a good thing to have that realization, and hopefully we move away from any complacent sense that everything's going to be okay into, well, look, there's a job to be done here and we can do it, and we do have the resources to do it.
What do you hope that people will take from your book? What everybody knows about Britain except the British?
Well, I think it's twofold. I mean, threefold. Let me say threefold. The first thing is that it is, as I say, there are things about the way that we look at ourselves both in our own country and in the world that need updating, that need modernization. There are some attitudes I think that we do need to rethink. Our institutions need an overhaul. Look at the leaders that we've had in the country. Look at the fact that we still have people who are in our upper house of parliament by birthright, which is extraordinary. We still have clerics in our upper house. And, so it's become a sort of dark joke that, the UK and Iran stand out as countries that, have clerics in these positions of political power. And so there's a big job to be done there. And it's really about sort of, putting that in front of people and saying, here are some things we need to think about. But it's also, as I said at the start, there's a sort of healthy dose of optimism in this and a pushback against some of the darker commentary that we now see that, oh, well, Britain is totally broken, there's nothing that can be done, which is a grotesque argument in my view, given that, this country still has a lot going for it, a lot of resourceful people and access to financial resources. And so, we can do better. And this book is about the possibility of doing better. And finally, it's also hopefully a good read. It sort of brings out some of the absurdities, lots of sort of little facts about, British life or the way Britain is overseas that readers might not know. So I hope that, that readers will also find it entertaining.
Yes. I mean, you can't just say that Britain is a broken third world country or whatever you want to say. But we have a functioning monarchy or whatever else around a cup of tea. I mean, that would be a somewhat strange outlook to have on life, wouldn't it?
Yes, I mean, the third world country narrative I think is pretty ghastly, and I don't like the term third world country for a start, but also it's having lived in countries and reported on countries which have been at war, have been in a state of social collapse, and really have very few resources. It's kind of obscene to compare Britain to that situation, because that's not just where it is at the moment. It is where it is largely because of choices of politics and perspectives, and those can be changed.
The book is called What Everybody Knows About Britain Except the British. It's by Michael Peel, who we're speaking to today. Michael, if people want to continue the conversation on the internet, you're on Twitter, formerly known as X, or the other way around. So where can people find you? Is that the best place to find you online?
Yeah, you can find me at Mike Peel Journo on Twitter, but also Google the book and you'll find it on Amazon and many other places. And I think it's in Smith's Travel and Waterstones and many other shops. So
and you'll be able to order it from our own virtual bookstore, and I encourage you to do so. The book is called What Everyone Knows About Britain Except the British: Home Truths from a Foreign Correspondent. It's by Michael Peel. Michael, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Giles. It's been great. Thanks so much for having me on.